We are now covering the second video pertaining to the gang feedback. And so I went ahead and moved on to what Blake had to say. The same basic question about why people would join gangs, things like that. But I did want to point out, this kind of covers some other people who'd asked a very similar question. And they say, oh, well, why does it seem like a lot of people come from poverty, or like gangs are in low income areas? Well, okay, so I'm going to kind of cover all that in one fell swoop. I at least attempt to. So first of all, answering this about why they join gangs, part of it, going back to income, a lot of gangs are in low income areas because that is people who live in those areas tend to, going back to whenever we talked about different reasons why, how people dealt with strain and all that. One was retreatism, which was drug usage, things like that. So, for one, the market is there. Okay, so drug sales are going to be in those lower income areas because that's unfortunately people, instead of dealing with their issues and trying to find other ways out of it, they use drugs to basically try to escape from that reality, and then ultimately end up being addicted. So, but then to further that same problem, you have lower income areas. So therefore, typically education levels are much lower. You tend to be in an area where you have less opportunity, or at least less perceived opportunities to improve. So a lot of people see the drug game as how they can make their money, how they can have power and authority over someone else. So essentially, that's a big part of that. Also, in your poorer neighborhoods, you have less cohesion. You tend to have a higher percentage of, in essence, broken families, broken homes, to where uh, let's say if there's a child, the parents not just aren't married, but they never have been, never were married. There's a lot of unwed mothers, basically, because in that culture, it's basically a lot of sex, a lot of drugs, without much supervision, without much education, or like a lot of ignorance, basically, and without much direction. And that's where the lack of father influence comes in terms of direction and some type of, I guess you want to say, obedience, but in essence, it's usually more so a fatherly influence of making sure someone stays on the right track. And that's where it's lacking, and so therefore the gangs step in basically as a well, you don't have much of a paternal influence or example, so we'll step in and basically be kind of like your mentor, your father figure, for lack of better terms. Sometimes the older gang members will come in and try to play this role of, not necessarily playing the role of dad, but of the person who has authority, and they're going to kind of bring you and put you under their wing and kind of help out. It's kind of how it's put out there. In addition to peer pressure, is another reason why people join. They have their families. Like I said, they have these parties, and so if you and your friends go to these parties, and say your friend is the one that had the family member who's a gang member throwing the party, it's just kind of an affiliation saying, okay, well, so and so, and you should be a part of. You're friends with them, so you might as well be in the same gang and ride together, essentially. So there's that. But then later on, it obviously changes in terms of what the focus is. And if you don't get in willingly, a lot of times you're going to go, or they'll try to get you in through intimidation, basically through, whether it be control over the business in the area, because they will do that, whether it be through extortion, offering protection, which once again, all that kind of goes back into some of those the origins of gangs and stuff, and I don't want to get into it too much because I think it needs its own separate area and discussion. So, needless to say, those are some big reasons. And yeah, so the father thing, the low income, low perceived opportunities, but yeah, they definitely people don't really talk a whole lot about it, but there is definitely an intimidation factor of if you don't join one gang or the other, they're both going to basically view you as the enemy. So take your pick, I guess. Pick one side to where the other side hates you, or try to live in the middle somewhere and be bothered by both of them. So yeah, it's not the easiest. All right, so going on here, let's see. Yeah, and this is DeVore actually brings up a really good point. Gangs, for as big and tough and bad as they are, they're kind of cowards in some ways. I mean, you're using kids to commit your crimes for you because I guess in one sense, they're smart enough to know that children aren't going to be charged as often or as harshly as what an adult would. So they will send kids out to do their bidding for them in terms of, drug deals or other crimes. So yeah, like I said, for those big bad gang members who don't have the nerve to do the stuff themselves. So either way. So, but that's a good point that DeVore brought up. All right, so let's go back and let's get down here. Caitlin, I know that you had brought up a point about, let's see here. I thought you brought up the point about female gangs. Let's see. Yeah, says here that, yes, you're right. Most gang membership is mostly male dominated. Very true. And I don't think it's as common as what maybe you thought it was, because I'm trying to remember now because I've done research on it, but I think it's something like, of all gang members, female gang members, I know this part I can say safely, make up less than 5%, and it's more like, I think, 3% of all gang members. So it's really not as prevalent as what some may think it is. And so there are supposedly, if you want to say female gangs, there are such gangs as that, but they typically are affiliated with the much larger, you might consider, male or male dominated gang. Okay. And there's really no benefit to the for the females in most cases. I mean, because a lot of gangs are based off of power, whether it be physical or monetary power or whatever the case is. And when it comes down to, say, the violent behavior that all of it involves, okay, or at least it's very much a part of gang activity, the female members or the female gangs cannot compete in that way. So that's why you don't see very many of them. They may be affiliated through a relationship with a gang member. They may, say, have a child by them. They may, they themselves be members, but it's because they know and are with a member of the gang already. So, like, whether it be gangster disciples, vice lords, etc., same thing. Okay. So they get in that way. And I already told you in the previous video about how they can get in. They can get sexed in. They can get beat in. They can also, the other reason why you don't see a whole lot of females is because to the gang, they aren't really that useful. And that's not being rude. That's just that's how it's viewed. Because in some cases, females for gang members can basically be used in a sexual sense to be, basically they can become prostitutes. Once they lose their value as a prostitute, if that's what they go into, if they're lucky, they'll get in some type of, you and I would call it administrative role, but it's rare, very rare. That and okay, say if you have someone who loses the ability to be a prostitute, um, or the next step, if they don't go prostitute, it would be more like shoplifting, getting supplies that way, theft, shoplifting. That's what they basically do. Um, but after that, that's kind of like put out to pasture because physically they don't have the capability of doing a lot of things. They can also get information maybe that other men can't. But beyond that, according to gangs, basically women don't provide a whole lot of benefit or bring much to the table except for the sexual side of being with the guy or the gang member. So yeah, I know TV and all that, they try to make it sound like these different female gangs are out there and doing all this kind of stuff. And are there female prison gangs? Yes, but as far as street gangs, you don't see it much. So it's usually just because they're related to or in a relationship with another gang member. So, all right, let's get back out of here. Try to cover a couple more of these real quick. I covered that one. Okay, and this one. I already covered the whole lower income places because they're the easiest market, basically. That's why, and it's easiest to overcome, and because it's low income, higher number of people that want your product if you're selling drugs, and it's also easier to, if you make money from those people or other drug sales, etc., other criminal enterprises, it takes less time and effort to be able to have some sort of exert some type of control, whether it be extortion or anything else over those groups. So that's why. In addition to the feeling of helplessness by a lot of people who live there. Already talked about the father figure. And let's see here. Nick. And I know that you asked about the father things before. Okay. Okay. And that pretty much same thing. We've already kind of touched on those. Christian, I know that you had brought up something about the number of gangs. And yeah, so the one thing I did want to point out about gangs, there are a ton of them. It doesn't mean, it's a huge, huge problem. It is a problem in some places. But the reason why there are so many of them is because most of them are very small. And most of them are very regional. As far as you may have, say 30 gangs. I know there are cities that have far more than that, but they're only covering very small, maybe a street or maybe a block, and that's really it. But they don't have anything in other cities. They don't have more than one, basically, chapter, if you want to call it that. So yeah, I mean, that's essentially why you have so many gangs, but they're not always affiliated with a number, a whole lot of influence nationwide or region-wide. So, okay. Brian, let's see where we're at time-wise. Oh, that one. That one will probably take a little bit longer to answer. As far as the offense to it, I'm trying to think anything else I did want to touch on that I could talk about in about a minute. Unfortunately, probably not. Let's see here, because I took some notes here to the side also. The only thing I did want to add to the reason why people join gangs is a sense of belonging, or like I said, without much of a family ties, that's something else. So, okay. I can probably touch on this next part pretty quick. How they get things into. Actually, I take that back. I will cover that in this next feedback. Sorry it's taking so long to go through these, but we'll get there. So there will be at least one more of the feedback videos for this, and then I will have an Origins